Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and in this video I'm going to be sharing with you my thoughts on Dragonsong Reprise Ultimate. I am just coming down off the high of clearing it myself for the first time, and as such I wanted to share how I felt about this Ultimate, both through Prague and now that it's over. The entire time people have been asking me, how do you like it so far? How does it stack up against the other Ultimates? Is it the hardest? Is it your favorite? I'm going to cover all of that in this video, even though the recency bias of having just done it is probably going to affect some of my opinions about the encounter. So for those unfamiliar, Dragonsong Reprise Ultimate is a long-awaited piece of content. It was originally scheduled to release in patch 5.51 back in Shadowbringers. However, due to the development of Endwalker being a priority over this high-end content due to the situation in the world, they decided to push it off until patch 6.11, basically a year later, if not longer. And as a high-end raider, I wasn't too super excited about that. A lot of people weren't as well, but given everything going on, of course, it was completely understood. So we waited patiently, we theorized, we just anticipated the moment where we would get our hands on this. And I'll say it right now, it was well worth the wait. And it was far more than I would have ever predicted, that I would have ever expected. And this is going to set a new bar for what Ultimate Raiders expect going forward. It's going to be tough for the next one, so I feel bad for whoever has to follow up Mr. Ozma, the code name for the developer of this encounter. Whoever has to follow him up is they're going to be in for a time. Now, Dragonsong Reprise is a 7+ phase encounter. Technically, some of the littler things in there you could count as a phase altogether if you really wanted to, and say as much as 9 phases happened in this encounter. It's basically a retelling of the most major moments in Heavensward, specifically against Thornton, his knights, and Nidhogg. Now, it starts off fairly familiar, but it evolves into something way different than we've ever had in an Ultimate before, and it gets major points from me for that. However, I want to pump the brakes. Because there are so many phases to this encounter, I could basically review every single one of them and share my thoughts on them. So that's what I'm going to do, although a bit truncated. So strap in, because we got a lot to talk about. Upon entering Dragonsong Reprise Ultimate, you are put up against the 3 bosses from the vault. And actually, the arena you're fighting on is not the final boss arena from the vault. They instead decided to, very strategically, use a section later on that's only featured in a cutscene right before Thornton escapes with his knights. And that is because of another very important story event that actually takes place in this location. So upon entering, you have, it's basically the ultimate version of the vault. You know, you have to kill these 2 knights and they have to die at about the same time. And then you also go through a little bit of a bonus phase with the remaining knight who is hanging off to the side and just casting spells before you got to the end right there. It's pretty straightforward, and I don't think anyone was really surprised by anything here. I myself went back into the vault before this came out, and I fully expected some of these things to pop up, and then they also threw some surprises in the way that the different knights actually interacted. The damage values were high, the DPS check, of course, being brand new into the instance and the encounter, feels reasonable enough, but not overwhelming, and then it just kind of goes in ways that you don't expect right at the end, and it just starts to kind of warp your perspective of what you think is gonna happen throughout the rest of the fight. So mechanically, this is fine, all standard. There really isn't too much for me to praise or knock. However, towards the end of the phase, I mentioned that there was a specific moment in Heavensward that this phase wants to reference and why the arena is located where it is. And that is that Hoshfont actually comes out and blocks a spear from Sir Zephyrin, just like he does in the main story. And just like he does in the main story, we have to watch our boy die. It's not a pleasant thing, but it's what I predicted would happen, what made the most sense to me before this even came out. So I felt a little vindicated, seeing that that was indeed the result. However, before even entering, people noticed something about the description of Dragonsong Reprise Ultimate. It mentions that what would happen if we saved our dear friend? So of course, seeing that Hoshfont is targetable, seeing he gets a debuff, but also seeing that there was realistically no way to save him led to a lot of discussion about how you could possibly save him. What would happen if we saved him? Did we need to save him here? But a lot of that discussion was shut down in the early days of Prague because after defeating Chairbird, and not even defeating, really, mind you, this was another really weird thing. After you get through this phase by surviving Sir Cherbert's final attack by getting him to a low enough health percentage, Thornton comes down, begins attacking, and, most groups will die almost immediately upon getting there their first time. That was when we were surprised by a checkpoint. Something that has never existed in Ultimate. In fact, something they have explicitly stated they would not do in Ultimates. So this was surprising in a lot of ways. One, you just needed to survive Cherbert's attack. You didn't have to do the entire phase properly. You could screw up the mechanics right there at the end and just have one person get through, and that was enough to reach this checkpoint. And that's, not unusual for other checkpoints, but in Ultimate, it's super not expected. But also, if there's a checkpoint here, then what about all the Hoshfont guesses? Because we clearly couldn't save him. And even if we could, it's not like we would take oh, you screwed up before the checkpoint, go back and re-instance. So we were just like, oh, I guess you're not supposed to save him. That's really just for dramatic effect. So, progging, we're all write that off. We're done with the Knights phase. But those thoughts just keep lingering. Like, why would they do it this way? Why would they do a checkpoint for the first time? Why would they make us watch that with Hoshfont? Maybe the checkpoint is just an emotional checkpoint, so we don't have to watch him die over and over again and lose the emotional impact of the events of Heavensward. Whatever the reason, at this point, we had a new concern, the new first boss that was in front of us, King Thornton. Now, King Thornton sets the expectations for the entire encounter, and that is a compliment. Most of the time, the first phases in an Ultimate, they introduce you to the idea of the Ultimate, some sort of major concept or narrative beginning to what story is trying to be told, but they are rarely such an expectation-setting first phase. Thornton immediately lets you know this is going to be like the other Ultimates you've done, and in ways you almost wish it wasn't, because Thornton immediately goes into using his Knights, and he does these massive downtime phases where you're not DPSing, you're not hitting anything, you're just focused on these incredibly tight movements that you have to be, it's like a dance. It's like the rest of Final Fantasy XIV. It's like the Bahamut trios, it's like Alexander, we've done these phases in Ultimate so many times before, but they are normally not at the very beginning of the phase. They're kind of at that mid to late point where they're trying to amp things up a little bit and get your heart racing because there's these major dance mechanics and you're trying to sweat. But the first mechanic is immediately taking a very simple prospect of getting into 2 safe spots and spreading out amongst players while then dodging an Earth AoE, while then baiting another one to then step to the side. And then all of a sudden you've got 3 dives on players, 2 proximity related tank busters, only 4 really safe spots and a split damage AoE. Now, fortunately, that's actually a pretty simple thing to resolve if you've been doing Ultimates before. You just have to properly take the time to gather all the data and kind of resolve it the only way you can imagine, or at least one of only a few ways you can imagine. And again, that's fairly standard. That's just how Ultimates work. It's about understanding how many permutations of RNG you personally need to know and be responsible for and be able to react to, and to get enough pulls in to repeat the process, learn it, get the movement down. And so, but it's just so early. It's the first thing. And it doesn't get any better. The very second mechanic, Sanctity of the Ward, is one of the most threatening early mechanics we've seen, at least one that works like this. It's just so much information, so much happening on the screen at the same time. There's these knights dashing all over and you gotta look away from the eyes, and there's this proximity damage, a light party split, followed by these meteors that are in these incredibly random patterns that you have to space so precisely while avoiding fire AoEs, baiting split damage ice AoEs. It's such a precise dance 2 minutes into the encounter. If this was E8S all over again, all the way back in Shadowbringers, this would look like a light rampant mechanic. This would look like a pug ender. But it's not really. It has a lot of very set rules. Again, it's very structured even when it's not trying to be. And so you just get this big expectation check right out the gate that you really don't expect. And then you realize you don't even know how long at this point is left in the encounter, and you're already exhausted. And that's pretty much the theme of the phase. Constant exhaustion over and over, offset by a couple of easier things that happen in between. I also really like how in the Thornton phase, after you get through the major mechanics, you get hit by ultimate end. And I was wondering if they would do this. In the normal mode of Thornton, he does this kind of like wild swing mode where he just runs at people and swings his sword pretty much randomly as a last act of desperation. Here it's more structured, but you can still see the kind of desperation that Thornton is having. So the fact that they even took that and made it a really simple dodge mechanic, I thought that was really, really neat. And again, the attention to detail here is something that just reverberates. I mean, at this point, we've already had these major Knights of the Round dances. You've had the Hush Font moment with the vaults in the night, the Knights in the vault. Sorry, you can tell I'm actually still a little excited to talk about it. And you wonder where it's going to go next. And you beat Thornton, and then all of a sudden you are in the final steps of faith, and you're like, oh, Nidhogg's here. Cool, this is where we're at next. Except it's not just Nidhogg, it's Estinian Nidhogg, or Nidstinian as I like to call him, just jumping and diving down, and you're probably dead the first time you get there. Now, as a polar opposite to the previous phase, Nidstinian is a lot more like the phases that are in between of the major trio phases. It is a boss that you have to constantly worry about hitting, and that there's a very, very specific dance you have to do with placements around the arena, a little bit closer to something like Nail or Living Liquid phases, where it's just all this really, really tight movement. Here, it's actually a little more random even, because you can be, again, assigned different responsibilities depending on how the mechanic wants to treat you. You could be one of the people dealing with these dives that come down, 3 different sets of dives, 3 people mark for 1, 2 people mark for 2, and 3 mark for 3. You could be the 1, 2, or the 3. On top of that, you could have a high jump, which drops a tower where you're standing, a spine shatter that drops it 10 yalms in front of you, or an elusive that drops it 10 yalms behind you. So you have to be ready to potentially aim either the forward or back arrows. You have to know where your spots can be based on your number. And you also need to know it based on who on your team gets assigned the same thing or gets assigned something different. So you need priority systems, you need rules, and that's all it's really trying to establish, but you also need to be dealing with Nidhogg throughout the entire phase. And it's a pretty short phase, only about 2 minutes long, to get used to this super intense dance. On top of that, having to deal with point blank AoEs or donut AoEs that can be in one of 2 orders, a split damage AoE on a target standing in front of him. Again, really tight movement, tight mitigation, but it's just this constant feeling of go, go, go. And it maintains that momentum that Thornton sets, but this time without pumping any brakes. So it raises the stakes a little bit more, and while I think it's mechanically easier than Thornton, the fact that you are now up against Nidhogg the entire time, and his position and which direction he's facing matters, and where you're placing it, you really have to be a lot more calculated here. And that gives the phase, again, that increased momentum, or to continue to use the momentum that the first phase, or the second phase with Thornton, I suppose, sets up. There's even this little tower dance. This isn't really that stressful. You just really have to understand what the possibilities are. Again, assigning people to kind of a base location, and then sending people to specific locations. Here's your priority of, if your tower doesn't have a 2, then you would move over. If you're the anchor for your tower, you can stay still no matter what. Baiting the AoEs after, and then these 2 massive tank busters that hit so hard you either really want invulns or to basically use every defensive cooldown in your arsenal. Fortunately, the fight's designed around that. There's not really any tank mechanics immediately before and almost none after for quite a long time. So it's the only tank mechanic that you're really dealing with for about 4 minutes. So taking either approach it seems very deliberate at the very least. The only thing that's kind of weird is the Dragonlance. That's not what it was originally called in the Nidhogg encounter. And B, it's just this random conal AoE, almost like a nerve check, like, oh, you're still paying attention, right? Don't just have to think about that. But I guess that's really the only down point. It's not really a down point, it's just awkward. Like, why is this here? They could have done literally anything else. They could have just auto-attacked 2 more times and it would have been more threatening, I think. But you spend the 2 minutes, you get through that, hopefully, and then you move on to what I like to consider almost a break in the action, something to let you breathe for a little bit before the fight really hits its crescendo. You go into an I phase. Now, this is in some ways a completely unique phase, and in other ways an ultimate version of a mechanic that happens during the Nidstinian phase in the final steps of Faith. So, 2 eyes come out. One is red, one is blue. If you've done Nidhogg Extreme, you recognize this as the Fang and Claw phase, where you have a blue eye that starts at 50% health, and tethers to players, and any player with a blue tether will heal that eye if they are hit by damage. So your goal is to make sure if you have a blue tether to never be hit by anything the whole phase. However, the red eye starts at 100% health, but actually takes damage whenever anyone tethered to that eye gets hit. So your goal is pretty straightforward. Make sure all of the players with a red tether take all the damage in the phase, and all the players with the blue tether avoid all the damage in the phase. It gives you a few seconds. There's a big bleed, a big AoE and a bleed to deal with. But immediately after that, it's all about, dancing between who has the tethers. And they made it really simple. If you have a blue tether, you can't pass to another blue tether player, but you can pass to a red tether. The red and blues can only exchange between each other, and there's even a 3-second period where you can't pass again. So they made sure they were really careful about these passes, that they weren't annoying to do. And that's really important because Final Fantasy XIV does not have a great track record with passing tethers or passing debuffs or things like that. It can still mess up a little bit, but it's certainly better than it could have been. I'm glad they took the steps that they did. But at this point, again, it's just about, making sure that you handle like these yellow orbs or split damage AoEs. So you have 2 people soak those together, and then you have 2 other players take the red tethers off of them and then go take these expanded AoEs. One thing I think is a really subtle detail that I really like is this orb expanding mechanic. So the orbs, you can pop them before they're fully expanded, and they don't really do that much damage to you when they're not that large. However, if you do pop them when they're smaller, then the red eye is actually going to take less damage. So they deliberately kind of force you into this very specific timing to make sure that you can deal the maximum amount of damage to the eye, and to force you to mitigate things, because if you were to just take this damage raw, it would be lethal. But you don't want to take less than that because you need to be able to kill the red eye quickly enough. So it's a nice little balance that I don't think gets a lot of credit, but by the time you've done it a few times, it's so second nature, you're not even really thinking about that detail. So I get it. And the only other mechanic is the Mirage Dives. These will target 2 red tethered players. However, they can target any of them. So after you've been hit, you have to pass your tether off to somebody else. Otherwise, the vulnerability it gives you could essentially result in you being killed. And if you die in this phase, you actually lose the tethers and you lose the buff that you get. Oh, that was something I actually completely skipped over. The phase begins by going into the very somber theme. I forget what it's called. I think it's called Condemnation, where it's just it's with the Dragonsong kind of piano, but it's no lyrics or anything. It's far more peaceful. And the phase starts with Hoshfont and Isael's ghosts giving you buffs. And you have to make sure you stack with Alphino, who is also in the arena, and you guys all share this buff, because if you don't get this buff, you can't actually damage the eyes. If you die in this phase, you lose that buff. So if you die at any point in this phase, you can't deal damage to either of the eyes. So failing no mechanics is very, very important. Making sure no blue tethers get hit by anything, making sure nobody dies. And for that reason, it's very simple. The eyes even do auto attack, so the tanks do have to take care of aggro, but that's not too big of a deal. Aggro in this game is not a whole big deal anymore. Now, once you've done with the 4 sets of Mirage Dives, you just have to finish off the eyes. You're actually supposed to basically finish one of them off on its own, and then go to the other one, because they do this big room-wide AoE. And if they both do it, it's just so much damage, it's probably going to kill people unless you spend a lot of resources. But on top of that, the blue eye is still tethered to people, so the blue eye is healing off that damage, and the red eye is actually still taking damage from that damage. So most groups you'll see kill the blue eye first, then swap to the red eye, and then even though it dies, the blue eye actually does heal from 0% back up to like 0.4 when it does the room-wide AoE. So then you just have to kill it again real quick, and then with that, you're done with kind of, again, what I consider the break phase. After you've done this phase enough, you get past Nid-Stinian, and this phase will be like a deep breath. And then the next phase even will eventually be a deep breath before it kind of gets serious again. Now, this was where things took a big turn in Prague, and this is what really got people excited about this, on top of the overall encounter design. At this point, the minstrel tells you that that's the end of the Dragonsong War. You've done it. There's actually even been a little progress bar that's filled all the way to 100. You've saved Istinian. You can move on and get ready for Stormblood. Minstrel is like, though, that's cool and all, but I wonder what would have happened if we saved Hoshfont. So he sends you back to the vault in the story, and he specifically sends you back to the moment where you have to defeat Sir Cherbert. You have to reduce his health enough so the AoE doesn't kill you. That is the exact moment that Hoshfont runs in front of Sir Zephyrn's spear. So what ends up happening this time, however, is you actually are able to have Limit Break. In the earlier phase, you actually only have an LB2, So, you know, and that makes sense. You know, they are dungeon bosses, so they give you a dungeon LB value instead of giving you all the way to LB3. And another reason why we thought we couldn't save him, there was no way to have LB enough to, you know, kill Chairbert faster or to save him with healer. There's nothing you could do. At least that's what we thought. When it loops back around, though, you do have LB3. And as soon as he pops up in the arena, he starts running in front of you to block Sir Zephyr's spear. You can tank LB3 and keep him alive. Makes it so you can actually heal him and keep him alive through the damage that he's taking. But in exchange, your group is also going to take a whole lot more damage, because while he's actually blocking the spear, and this is true in the earlier phase as well, the raid is taking damage. So when he dies in the earlier phase, that raid damage stops. But here it continues, and it's like 5,000 damage a second. So it adds this really immense heal check, on top of still needing to meet the DPS check for Sir Chairbert of getting him under 30%, and still dealing with his mechanics, which do deal a lot of damage. These conal AoEs followed by these baited AoEs that you need to make sure you avoid can very easily overwhelm and kill if you aren't really tight on mitigation. And I think that's another thing. I've never felt like an ultimate had as tight of a mitigation check as this. Maybe Golden Bahamut, I'd say that was a fairly tight mitigation check. But this whole phase kind of feels like any sort of slip up on mitigation or shields or anything, it's an instant snowball. And there's almost no way you're getting out of it in one piece. And that's, again, really impressive. You know, I've caused a few wipes by forgetting a Troubadour and thinking to myself, oh, I missed that. But there's no way that's why we died. Going back and looking, oh yeah, the Troubadour is definitely why we died. not having it there is definitely why. So again, yeah, just really tightly balanced, and it's really impressive what they did with that. But once you manage to stop Sir Chairbert, you got to make sure your healers are still keeping Hoshfont alive until that very moment, including all the way at the end of the phase, because Sir Chairbert does do that room-wide AoE that he did back before you went to the checkpoint. Then on top of that, you actually still need to kill the spear, or break the spear, that he's blocking. So you have to go over and DPS down the Spear of the Fury before it finishes casting Pierce. Pierce will instantly KO Hoshfont if it finishes casting. So, you know, that's that. And then you've saved him. Now we think to ourselves, all right, we saved Hoshfont. And obviously that would change the timeline if it did, but like, okay, whatever. We saved him and that's the end of it. But as the minstrel is very, very eager to tell you, you know, you saved one life, but you know, that usually has an effect. What kind of effect would that have? And nobody was expecting the result that we ended up getting. So this begins what's known as the alternative Dragonsong War, where we learn what would have happened had Hoshfont actually survived his encounter in the vault. First and foremost, apparently not spurred on by the death of our ally, we allow Thornton to get just enough of a heads up on us so that he gets to Bismarck, he gets the key, he makes it to Azislaw before us, he gets into the center of the Aetherochemical Research Facility, he absorbs the ether of the Warring Triad, and we never get there in time to stop him. Assumingly, he still kills La Habrea and Igiorm using the eye. I'd have to assume that still happens and that he doesn't just let them go, given what his original plans were. But his ether pool is so immense now that he actually begins to use Nidhogg's eye in Ascalon to temper dragons. And the first thing he does is we meet him over in, I forget the name of the arena, but it's the arena up at the north of the Churning Mists, where you fight where you do the Dark Scale fate. I forget the exact name, but it's all the way to the north of the Churning Mist, and he tempers Darkscale, Vedderfolnir, and Vidofnir, and they become part of his Knights of the Round. They join the Knights. He's trying to take control of his enemies in order to be a more effectively more powerful. And that leads to what is essentially the second unending coil of Bahamut, because a bunch of unending coil mechanics start popping up. More specifically, now you know what I'll say, just all of them. There's Twintanya mechanics, there's nail mechanics. I think there are also Bahamut mechanics. I'm trying to think. Maybe there aren't. There's definitely those two though. There's definitely dragon mechanics, you know, that you would find familiar if you did the unending coils. And it makes for what I like to call Drew Cobb, because I call this Dragonsong Reprise Ultimate, and then you have U-Cobb, so I call this Drew Cobb. And that's what it is. It's just U-Cobb 2 Electric Boogaloo. And that was a major shock. I definitely expected to see some familiar dragon mechanics because of Nidhogg. I didn't expect to see them because of Thornton, although Thornton actually did have a lot of coil mechanics, even in normal mode, which surprised a lot of people at the time. So I suppose it's still, it kind of follows suit to some capacity. And again, this is actually a lot like Thornton's first phase. I mean, he does these two major dances, Wrath of the Heavens and Death of the Heavens. I'd say they are mildly more difficult. Maybe even not. I honestly think this phase is largely the same difficulty, but Death of the Heavens is so late in the fight, and the amount of pulls you'll get to practice it is so much lower that it is inherently more difficult to do consistently. There's almost no variance in the way you can approach it. There's a tiny bit, but not a whole lot. And it requires such tight execution and movement that, again, any sort of slip up and you're back to the beginning. There are, ways that you can get through even with a death or two, but it starts combining. You got to remember, it's now combining Thornton's mechanics with the Knight's mechanics with Dragon mechanics. So the number of things on the table is just so high. So the first time you do these things, it's so incredibly overwhelming, especially when you get to the PlayStation tethers from the first phase, which you haven't done again since then. And those get mixed in with spread damage AoEs and needing to be knocked towards doom puddles from the Faith Unmoving. And there's a spear AoE and cauterizes coming from the dragons. And there's twisters dropping at your feet. It's everything imaginable they could have thrown at you all at once. And the only reprieve is that it's, at the end of the day, a downtime dance. You're just trying to focus on the mechanics and not trying to DPS the boss at the same time. So that gives it a little bit of, it pumps the brakes a little bit more than I think most people would have expected. But then something else really weird happened. So now we're on this alternative timeline. We're 10 plus minutes into the fight. We've survived Wrath of the Heavens, Death of the Heavens, and the end of the Thornton phase is kind of similar. He, instead of, being weak and doing the whole swinging around thing, like desperately, at just under 3%, soon as you bring him to 2.9%, he actually starts begging for his life. And this is another branching timeline that can happen. If you do not spare his life, you will go on to face Nidhogg and Hraesvelgr, and that's the next phase, spoiler, by the way. You'll go on to face Nidhogg at the final steps of Faith, but you won't have the same result. Because now, when you go to try to save Estinian from Nidhogg's eyes, you are going to not have the ether of your dead allies. You won't have Hoshfont, you won't have Issail. I think you do still get a buff from Issail, but I'm pretty sure she's alive and fighting in the background. She also never dies, apparently, in this timeline. So I haven't seen that. I actually would like to see it, but I haven't seen it because we never got to the point where we beat the dragons without sparing Thornton. So you just lose at that point. You can't save Estinian, so you may have saved Hoshfont, but you lost the war at the end of the day. But if you spare Thornton, he begs for mercy and then mocks your compassion, then he jumps away and leaves Ascalon behind. Now, a lot of people have wondered, if we let Thornton get away, how does Nidhogg return? And that's because Thornton actually leaves Ascalon on the ground, and the other Dragon Eye is in Ascalon. Because of all the ether he absorbed from Azys Lla, he doesn't need Ascalon in order to maintain his primal form. He still has his knights, he's now tempered dragons, and his reservoir of ether is whatever Azys Lla had tucked away in the Etherochemical Research Facility. He just doesn't need the eyes anymore. So Estinian will take the eye, he will hold them both together, and Nidhogg will take him over. But for some reason, Nidhogg just takes a completely different approach to the Dragonsong War this time around. What ends up happening is when Nidhogg descends upon Ishgard in the final steps of Faith, he actually uses Neurolink technology on Hraesvelgr in order to enslave him and make him part of the offensive, because no doubt Hraesvelgr, with his vow, would have denied attacking Ishgard. And that one's weird to me only because the logical way that happens is there's two things. One, he saw what had happened to Tiamat, which wasn't so much, it was neurolinking technology, but it was really just sealing them away and not demanding them to do things. But I guess after Thornton, I don't know, I guess after he went to Azys Lla and absorbed all of the Warring Triad, through that Nidhogg's eye that was an Ascalon learned more about neurolinking technology and decided to use it against his own brood who refused to fight against Ishgard. Maybe they battled on their own terms and Sorkai or something, and Nidhogg, just after being the victor, decided that was the best outcome. And that plays a major role in the next fight, because now you have to fight both Nidhogg and Hraesvelgr at the same time. And that is a time indeed, because I think that's the hardest phase in the entire encounter. So this phase has two major rules while you're actually doing all of the mechanics. For one, Hraesvelgr has a vow with Shiva. If many of you have done the story, you know what that is. He's not allowed to claim a mortal life. He can kill other dragons if he really wants to, but he cannot kill a person. That is what he promised Shiva, and that's what saves our hides with him a fair number of times. However, with the neurolinking technology, he doesn't have a choice, realistically. He has to attack. So what happens is, if Hraesvelgr kills anybody, he actually falls into a rage from breaking his vow with Shiva, and then he becomes unkillable. He's just empowered by it. He takes less damage. He deals lethal damage with every single attack. So if anybody dies to a Hraesvelgr attack across the entire phase, you essentially wipe. There's no way you're going to finish this encounter. On the flip side, Nidhogg's vow, I don't remember the exact vow, but I think it has something to do with inflicting eternal suffering upon Ishgard. So his goal is not to wipe Ishgard out. It is to ensure that they suffer for eternity, because as a dragon, you know, he'll be able to enjoy it. It's like a blink of the eye to him. But for them, they'll feel the effects of time and like this constant oppression from Nidhogg and his brood. And so he gives you a debuff called Mortal Vow, and it deals damage over time, constant suffering. And then it eventually explodes, and if you don't give the Mortal Vow to another person to continue the suffering, then Nidhogg's vow is broken, and he goes into a rage. It's far more technical than Hraesvelgr's, but essentially those are the two conditions that have to be endlessly met throughout the encounter. If Nidhogg kills someone, but the Mortal Vow still goes off, then you're fine. But if Hraesvelgr kills anybody, it's over. So it's a very tight phase, because the pressure's on absolutely everybody to not make even the smallest mistake. And the rest of the phase is, again, unlike Thornton, this is pretty much constant uptime with both of these dragons. You need to constantly be monitoring how much damage you're dealing, which one of them is higher, which one of them is lower, what mechanics they're doing, where are they on the arena, because they fly around for their different mechanics. And the big thing is balancing the health, because they have 2 points in the fight where if their health is not within about 3% of each other, then they actually just blow somebody up. The dragon with more health actually will just blow up a team. Normally it's just 2 light party stacks, 4 players each, but the light party of the dragon that's 2 high on health just gets absolutely obliterated. If that happens to be Hraesvelgr, it's instantly over. But I'll be honest, if you suffer 4 deaths in this phase, at best you're picking it up and trying to progress just to see more mechanics at that point. And I think they did a fantastic job with the mechanics during this phase. Definitely my favorite phase. Definitely the phase I think is the hardest, because there's just so many things that can go wrong. The Mortal Vow passes, even being slightly off with an AoE. Somebody accidentally getting clipped by something from Hraesvelgr. Somebody just losing their attention for a few seconds. But the big mechanic is Wrath Flames, which actually marks 4 players with a dark debuff, 2 players with a light debuff, and 2 players with nothing. On top of that, it does the orbs from Nidhogg Extreme, the Bomberman explosion ones. He does Akmorns that you have to be baiting because they leave puddles behind. So if you stand in the puddle, you'll bleed and die. The Mortal Vow player is taking bonus damage. There's a Cauterize through the room. So you have to do this incredibly tight, very specific movement in order to make sure everything is resolved. There's so many different permutations of where you might have to go and who has what debuff, and that's why somebody actually hits a macro that puts markers over everyone's head, so to remind us of our priority for when we actually line up, because afterwards the 4 dark AoEs need to spread away from everyone else, and the 2 light AoEs are split damage AoEs, so they need to pair up with 1 unmarked player each. And then 3 seconds after that is over, there's a Mortal Vow pass. It just instantly is like this constant barrage of mechanics. And this is a major choke point for the phase, because after that, honestly, it's not that bad. There's some new positioning you have to learn for the remaining mechanics, both the tethers and the Hallowed Wings plus Hot Tail. Oh, and there's a Hot Tail or a Hot Wing from Nidhogg at the same time after you've done all the Bomberman bombs as well. So you got to be paying attention to that and know how to spread out within the narrow Hot Wing versus the very wide Hot Tail. It's a lot. And even though it's only like a 3-minute phase, this phase feels like eternity. I see how the dragons see time now, because that phase feels like an eternity. So, but once you get through it, it's just a matter of consistency. This is your huge consistency check, along with Death of the Heavens and Phase 5 and Thornton beforehand, because once you manage to get through all of that, once you get through the Cauterize after having the correct debuff and going to the correct side to make sure you cancel out debuffs, and then finishing this final DPS check after one final Mortal Vow Pass, you now, at this point, you'd think, oh, the war is over. And if you killed Thornton, then this is where the team would wipe, because they are unable to free Estinian. However, by leaving Thornton alive, we kind of resolve one of those issues in exchange for a much worse one. Alphino shows up. He's like, okay, he got to save Estinian. He starts attacking the eyes. They start doing those big room-wide damage bleed AoEs from the earlier phase. But Thornton shows up and goes, oh, I'm going to take all of these eyes and I'm going to become the ultimate god. So he eats Nidhogg's 2 eyes. He eats Hraesvelgur's 2 eyes. And Hraesvelgur, by the way, who thanks you for killing them. They're like, oh, thank God you killed me. Now I won't break my vow, and I can be with my beloved, which is heartbreaking, by the way. Instead, he has his eyes eaten, and he becomes part of this amalgamation of Thornton, who takes on the aspects of both dragons and becomes the Dragon King Thornton. Essentially the ultimate god of amongst, because not only does he have the Warring Triad, he has 4 dragon eyes. That's a lot of ether. There's no way we can do that. And I love the little detail. Alphino, when he sees that Thornton is actually absorbing the eyes, he grabs Estinian, who was freed because the eyes were taken from him. He tries to like get him away, but you're like, there's no way you're getting out of here in time, Alphino. He does get away. They like disappear like NPCs do when they just need to move, but I'm like, there's no way you're getting out of the way. But he does, and that's fine. And then we come into the final phase, and we're like 15 minutes into the fight at this point. And all of a sudden, now you got to deal with Dragon King Thornton. This final phase is a lot like the Golden Bahamut phase back in UCOB. It's about a 3-minute, really tight execution and mitigation check alongside the final DPS check of the encounter. But this one is a lot more technical than I think the previous finales have been. Now, I want to be more clear. The last approximately 3 minutes, probably even a little bit less than that, of all of the ultimate encounters normally involves a tank mechanic, a party split damage mechanic, and some kind of AoE to avoid. Golden Bahamut is Akmorn's, I forget the name of the, I think it's not, I keep wanting to say Akafa because of this encounter. He has a tank damage split AoE, he has a party split damage AoE, and then he has Gigaflares, which just send the AoEs across the arena. You just gotta move between them real quick. You have Ultima Weapon, Ultimate, which does each of the primal mechanics. It does an Ifrit mechanic, a Titan mechanic, and a Garuda mechanic before he starts actually charging up his Enrage. And then for Alexander, you have the AoEs, the 3 AoEs that go one at a time. He has a split damage AoE on the party, and then he has, a tank swap. He has, he hits a single tank, and then well, technically it's a split tank buster followed by a single tank buster that requires a swap, but we end up usually just invulning that and then stacking for one of them. So again, he has a tank mechanic and AoE. This one doesn't really do that. He does do 3 mechanics that essentially rotate, but then he mixes in some other things that you have to just manage throughout the entire phase. So he starts with Gigaflares, but they're nothing like any of the Gigaflares we've seen before. Because he's grown like a tail with another sword, and he has 2 swords in his actual hands. All of his mechanics come from the swords, and every single one of his major attacks comes assisted with either a point-blank AoE or a donut. So Gigaflare's Edge will do either fire swords to get out of his hitbox, or ice where you have to be in his hitbox. And then on top of that, it starts an Gigaflare from each of his sword locations, and those patterns are wildly random. So you have to dodge the Gigaflares while dodging the donut AoE or the point blank AoE, and that gives you a bunch of different permutations. Fortunately, the World Second Group figured out a fairly consistent strategy, regardless of which one you do, but it is incredibly overwhelming the first time you see it. Fortunately, again, with experience or with smart thinking, a lot of these things can be broken down to very simple elements. Now, immediately after getting through that, though, you're introduced to a fairly unique mechanic for Dragon King Thornton. His auto attacks all give either a dark resistance down or a light resistance down. And he will always target your top 2 aggro as well as the closest party member. Now, this is very interesting because the tanks essentially will take 2 autos and then tank swap because they want to swap which of the 2 debuffs they're getting, dark or light. But the third player gets 1 dark and 1 light debuff and a physical vuln. So if they eat another auto attack afterwards, they'll die. So basically, the other 6 members of your party need to take turns being the closest person to Thornton while also not being too close to anybody else in order to eat that third auto attack safely and control it. And Thornton will do 2 of these auto attacks between each major mechanic. So we ended up sending our 2 melees in first after the first mechanic, the Gigaflare, 2 melees after the next mechanic, which will be Akmorn's Edge, and then our 2 healers would go after Gigaflare's Edge, which again, these are all dragon mechanics, these are all familiar mechanics, and they're pretty much all Bahamut mechanics as well. So this is again another very UCOB similar phase. So after dealing with the 2 autos, you come to Akmorn's Edge, which actually puts 3 Akmorn locations, 2 on his like front right and front left, and then 1 on his rear. The front left and front right ones require 3 players, and the ones on his tail require 2 players. So 2 tanks take the one on the tail, and then your 2 other parties, light parties of 3, take the other 2 spots. He does a point blank AoE and or a donut AoE, one of the 2. So you need to make sure you're standing in the circle, but you're also avoiding whichever AoE it is. And then this is a massive mitigation, just bam, 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 hits all the party with these constant repeating Akmorns, and you're standing just apart enough from each other that if you don't take a step in and after the first mechanic goes off, after the first blast goes off, that you might not even be able to reach each other with the healing. Very simple position check, but very nerve-wracking heal and mitigation check. After that is 2 more autos, and then the last real mechanic of the fight, which is Gigaflare's Edge. This is 3 proximity AoEs, and you just have to go opposite of each of them while mitigating and healing. He will do a point blank or a donut AoE right at the start, but after you dodge that, you just have to make sure you're rotating around. So go opposite of the first one, then rotate over again. And again, it's just scary from a mitigation and healing standpoint, because not only do you have to be mitigating, healing, you have to kill the boss. You are on a timer at this point. After you've seen these 3 edge attacks, Gigaflare, Akmorn, and Gigaflare, and then also after there's been 2 autos following each of those, essentially the fight repeats once more. You go through X's 2 autos, you go through Akmorn 2 autos, you go through Giga 2 autos, and then it'll do a couple more things. It'll do the Gigaflare 2 autos, Akmorn 2 autos, and then you actually hit the Enrage. And this Enrage, I think, is probably the least exciting. You know what? Not even least exciting. It's about as exciting as Golden Bahamut's Enrage. It's not as flashy or extravagant as Uwu or Perfect Alexander. It's basically Akmorn's Edge, except that they only require 1 person each, and they will kill the person who stands in them. So what ends up happening is you want to send your lowest DPS into the first hit, your second 3 worst DPS into the second hit, and then it's up to your third DPS to finish. And this is only about a 5-second time frame because the first, second, and third hits all come out just a couple of seconds apart. And the third hit you just kind of ignore because you can actually get an extra attack in potentially if you don't take the immediate damage and you just let the mechanic fail and blow up on the raid because nobody was standing in it. It really surprised me. I didn't think it was going to be as quick as it was. The first players die, and then the second players have to go in pretty much immediately after the first player's health bars go away. So you do not have a whole lot of time here to actually deal with it. But considering everything you've been through up to this point, it is just, such a relief. I'm relieved even thinking about the fact that I'm just done with it. I don't have to think about it anymore. I'm getting some sushi after I'm done recording this video. I need to relax. And with that, you get about a 19-minute encounter. And even with all the downtimes, even with some of the easier phases like the eyes, and after you've done it a couple of times, the, saving Hush Font phase, it's just, it's see, I just break down thinking about it. It's stressful, it's intense, and it is rewarding as all hell to know that you are finished with your first clear of an encounter such as this. They just went, it just elevates past anything we've had with an ultimate before. especially in the storytelling. The way they went down this alternate what-if path, but forced you to relive it initially so you could kind of spot all the little differences, sparing no expense with the little narrative changes, having Isael and Hoshfont fighting in the background in the final sips of faith after you've actually saved Hoshfont, Alphino having new text lines when Thornton shows up to eat the eyes, and even just the little things like Thornton begging for his life, of course mocking the Warrior of Light genuinely being someone who might actually let him get away. That's something you could reasonably see our Warrior of Light potentially doing, especially back in the Heavensward days where we really didn't get any choices in our dialogue, at least not meaningful ones. Heck, even now they're not really that meaningful, but they're better now than they were way back in the day. The fact that the story and the lore and the narrative is just built in makes it so much better, and then the encounter design is all wrapped around it too. The more you understand about Heavensward, the more you understand about these encounters, the better the encounter is and the more smoothly you can actually get through it. So this just raises the bar. Even Yoshi P said he thinks it's the hardest ultimate they've ever released because they had to take into account players are a lot better at the game than they were back in the Unending Coils, and players are capable of a lot more, and we have new game systems and we have new skills, so we need to account for all those things. So that alone just means they also had to raise the bar. And I really do think that if we had gotten this at the end of Shadowbringers, it wouldn't have been as good. I think they would have held back in some regards. I do wonder how different the incarnation of this in 5.51 would have looked like versus the incarnation we got in 6.61. And the fact that I even think that means that that's why I say the wait was worth it, because I do think that it just wouldn't have been as good if we had gotten it back then. As much as I would have loved having one, and we'd probably be talking about like the Warring Triad Ultimate right now or Omega Ultimate or something like that, and I'd love to have those things. I feel like there's so many lessons learned here. There's so many new things tried. And at the same time, it still just feels like an ultimate. Like the mechanics themselves, like the actual mechanics you need to perform to successfully survive, they are just different enough from what we already know without really breaking new ground. I just felt like I was doing an ultimate. I said that other than the stress of progression, like new prog points or like that very end where your hands are shaky and you don't even press the right buttons, but you're like, I can't die. As long as I don't die, we got this. That's always there. But the rest of the fight wasn't really that stressful as someone who's been doing a ton of ultimate, over the years. And that's a really weird feeling to have, to be in the middle of prog and to just be like, I'm not worried about this. This is easy. I've done this a million times, even before this fight came out. But at the same time, to be excited about it almost every time. And don't get me wrong, when you've repeated the Thornton phase 1,000 times, you're no longer that excited about it. You might think about it like I do in retrospect and think about how you felt progressing it. But when you've done it 1,000 times, you're not that excited to do it 1,001 times. So I got bored. I was yawning. I was like, whatever. But I never lost my appreciation for it. I was just so impressed with what they had put together and how they're going to follow it up. And not to mention, they did something else that was very different. We didn't really get very many remixes of music here. This isn't like Alexander or Ultima, where it's just like we're just laden with these musical remixes. It was a lot more, again, like the Unending Coil, where they just cleverly used the music we already had in the game and matched it to the specific phases based on what they wanted to do. And we went through a lot. We went through the Vault Final Boss music, the Vault Dungeon music. We went through Thornton's bass music. The only real theme that I would have expected was the Primal's version of Heroes, but having listened to it, I'm kind of glad they didn't. I don't think it would have fit the fight or the pace of the fight as well as the original version of Heroes. So, again, I'm glad they went with that. But then you've got, the Nidstinian music from Final Steps of Faith. You have the Condemnation, I think, which is, from the cutscene at the end of Heavensward where you're saving Estinian. You have Dragonsong when you're dealing with Nidhogg and Hraesvelgr. You have just all these different tracks that they use throughout Heavensward to really, again, nail home the point of telling a story. And the best part is, at the end of it all, the minstrel himself gives you a little sign-off. Like, you see Dragon King Thornton die, and you see both Hraesvelgr and Nidhogg, fly up into the sky like you saw Nidhogg did when you freed Estinian at the end of Heavensward. And now those are two of Midgardsormr's children that were lost in the conflict. And he goes over about how, loss, and he talks about loss, and he talks about being a hero, and he talks about what the possibilities could be, and how you know, a single life just has so many effects on the way things play out. He's narrating every phase as you get to it, giving you a brief synopsis of how the story has changed, or, you know, how the story was told the first time around. And when it all comes together in the end, he closes the book on Heavensward, a reimagining, very similarly to the way that we experienced the actual Heavensward story from the I can't remember Hoshfont's dad's name right now. I'm almost an hour into recording. Yeah, I keep thinking of the children. Yeah, you know who I'm talking about. It's the book closing. He narrates all of Heavensward. I just can't remember it. I'm so sorry. Listen, maybe I could Google it, or I can Google it right now. Hoshfont. I'm just gonna Google Hoshfont. Hoshfont Greystone. Cool. Listen, this is sometimes you have to do this. You just have to look up House for Tom. There you go. I got it. Edmont. There you go. It's very similar to Edmont basically narrating, except that now it's the minstrel. He tells you it's an alternate story, closes the book on it, and it's such a beautiful end before the screen goes black, and it just tells you, you won. It's just every detail. I don't know how they're going to top this. I don't know how they can. I mean, they can. The quality of the story and the raid series and everything, it's high. It goes up after Heavensward. It went up in Heavensward. So it just makes me even more excited for Ultimate, because this is just now this what if scenario thing they did opens a whole lot of doors. Up until now, I've been saying there is no chance the Warring Triad will have Kefka, because the Wandering Minstrel just tells us what happened. He doesn't make stuff up. Here, he made stuff up. He basically looked at what are the possibilities of if Hoshfont had died, which is not quite the same, but let's be honest, if he's just going to throw things in there that never happened, Kefka can totally be a part of the Warring Triad Ultimate now. And I think we will see them go that route. I'm flipping that prediction that I've had for years. I said there's no way Kefka could be a part of the Warring Triad. Now I'll be shocked if he doesn't just go, but what if somebody had managed to harness the power of the Warring Triad, upset the delicate balance that Aziz La had put into effect and brought it crashing down upon Eorzea. And then there's just going to be like, wasn't there a story Omega told? And then Omega and Shinryu, we could fight, like Omega and Shinryu could be fighting each other, and we're like in between their attacks and aiming their attacks at each other. And Omega, maybe, I don't know, maybe he absorbs Midgardstormer. Maybe he wonders about a future. And if Omega had absorbed Shinryu, or if he had beaten Midgardstormer, who knows what they'll do? And that's exciting when we don't know what to expect. After all the predictability we get in Final Fantasy XIV, that's what's exciting. And if you sat through over 50 minutes of me rambling on about all this, I hope that at least that takeaway is something you quite look forward to. On that note, I'm hungry. I'm going to wrap this video up. Yeah, it was great. We'll see if I still feel that way in like a few months looking back on it after beating it a few more times. Who knows, but man, go enjoy the kill VOD, and I'm going to be releasing some more stuff for this in the near future. Anyway, thanks for watching. Be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share, and I'll see you all in the next video. And until then, take care.